Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ MV, Angela Yee, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club. We got a special guest in the building, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Welcome, sir.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us.
Hakeem, tell the people what it is that you actually do for those who may not know.
So I have the privilege of representing the 8th Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives. That's Brooklyn, Queens, downtown Brooklyn, Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, Bed-Stuy, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, East New York, Canarsie, Coney Island, several neighborhoods along the southern part of the borough, and a few neighborhoods in Queens, Howard Beach, and Ozone Park.
You know, so for some reason, people think, especially black people, we think that any black person working in government is part of the establishment and doesn't have our best interests at heart. You know, what do you think about that?
Well, my thing is that, you know, the House of Representatives as an institution, the body that I serve in, it was really designed to be that place that was closest to the people. So all of us who are in the House, I think, should be trying to reflect and represent the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations of those that we serve. And oftentimes that means going against what one might view as the establishment. So when I was in the Assembly, for instance, even though I was in New York and Senator Obama was running against then Senator Clinton, several of us in the state legislature broke with the establishment, even though we could conceivably have been considered part of it, to support then Senator Barack Obama. We did the same thing, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, myself, and a few others, when we helped elect Ken Thompson in 2013 to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office against the then incumbent elected official DA Joe Hines. So I think that word gets tossed around often, but there's a lot of nuance underneath who's serving your best interest, who's not, even if we're inside the Capitol Dome.
And rest in peace, Ken Thompson, too.
Yeah, rest in peace to Ken Thompson. It just sounds, I get when people be like, oh, you be like, I'm in the house. Like, it's like they think the whole house nigga, field nigga mentality. But they don't meet brothers like you who are actually in there representing for our best interests every day.
Well, how did you get into it? How did you start?
Well, I grew up in Crown Heights and all in Brooklyn my entire life, with the exception of the time that I went away to school. Came back home, was practicing law, and in the early part of the 2000s, just decided that I wanted to use, you know, the training, the academic experience that I had, hopefully to represent a few communities in Brooklyn that I hope to represent. So I ran against, as a young lawyer, a 20-year incumbent who was backed by the Brooklyn Democratic machine, the Albany political establishment. You know, I had no name recognition, no money in the bank, no prior political involvement. Challenged the establishment, lost, but did reasonably well. Shocked the establishment. That laid a foundation for me to ultimately be successful a few years later. Was elected to the Assembly, spent 6 years there, and in 2012 got elected to Congress.
I mean, you brought hip hop to the house, though. You rapped "Juicy" by Biggie on the House floor, right, or the Senate floor?
House floor, you got it.
Yeah.
Well, that was interesting because that was the 20th anniversary of the tragic death of Biggie Smalls. So I was in my office, and I got a call from Stacey Plaskett, who represents the Virgin Islands, and she's like, "Yeah, they're playing Biggie tributes all over. Cut the internet on." Right? So I did have my staff do it. And I wasn't expecting, or I didn't come to the office that day saying I was going to go to the House floor and do a tribute to Biggie Smalls. But as I was listening to his music, I was just reflecting upon what it meant to me when I was, you know, coming of age in the 1990s. I was in law school at the time when he passed. And I said to my staff, you know what? I'm going to go to the House floor and give a tribute to Biggie Smalls on this occasion. Some of my staff, that's a good idea. Others was like, nah, you can't do that. You're a member of Congress.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, check the House record and see whether there have been tributes that have been given to Frank Sinatra or Elvis Presley or Bruce Springsteen. They came back. Yeah, tributes to all three. So if we can tribute and shout them out,
Damn right.
we should be able to tribute and shout out Biggie Smalls. So that's when I went down to the
And what
floor.
was their reaction?
On the floor?
Yeah, when you did, it was all a dream. That's what it was. You did Juicy.
Yeah, that's right. With a big image of Biggie Smalls with the crown on his head. I think the Republicans were in shock when it was unfolding. They didn't process what was happening, but the reaction from people across the country, and in some instances the world, was amazing. though the most significant text that I got, which I'll never forget, was from Mrs. Wallace late that night and said, just thank you for remembering my son.
That's dope.
And that alone made it all worth it.
So none of the Republicans knew? Mark Rubio knew.
Mark Rubio, yeah. So, but he's on the Senate side, so he ain't say it on full.
Okay. So, but none of them in the House knew what you were doing.
There were a couple of younger members, yeah.
Now listen, is this reparations conversation serious, or just smoke being blown up our ass? Because I feel like it's just a talking point for this election cycle.
It's a great question. This is the most serious that I've seen it to date. And I think there's a couple of reasons that explain it. One, we're in what I would call the third backlash moment, right? So this country has always made progress on questions of race, social, economic, racial justice. And then, Charlamagne, as you know, then there's always a backlash, right? So you have the original sin of slavery. In fact, 400 years ago this month, the first slave ship left the west coast of Africa to come to the United States, arrived in August of 1619, Jamestown, Virginia. So we'll be commemorating that solemn occasion over the next few months. Chattel slavery ends, and then you have the Reconstruction era, 13th Amendment, right? Outlaw slavery, 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of race. That's from 1865 to 1878, and then boom, the North pulls out of the South. Reconstruction ends abruptly, and the first backlash moment comes to the United States. Jim Crow rises up in the South, the Black Codes, the lynching epidemic, the KKK, and we deal with that for about 100 years. And then a new moment of progress arises, right, with the Civil Rights Movement, the 1950s, 1960s, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dr. King, John Lewis rise up, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, War on Poverty, Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, 1968, the Fair Housing Act passed. And then in that same year, King's assassinated in April of 68. Kennedy is assassinated in June of 68. And then Richard Nixon gets elected in November of 1968, running against the progress that had just been made, capitalizing on anxiety with what was called the Southern Strategy. And then you have a second backlash period, anti-bus and anti-affirmative action. The rise of the mass incarceration epidemic starts on Nixon's watch in 71 when he declares a war on drugs. And we deal with that. Reagan accelerates it. And then boom, we have a third moment of progress with the election of Barack Obama. And I remember thinking initially, there's no way that Donald Trump can get elected.
We all thought that.
Right? Almost all of us thought that. But then after he got elected, I said, you know what? Had we put his election in the context of history and realized that every time there's been meaningful progress, there's a fierce backlash that emerges, we would have probably saw it coming. And that's exactly what took place, right? So we're in a third backlash moment. Now, every time we're in a backlash moment, people rise up to move the country forward. So bringing it back to the reparations conversation, whenever we've made unthinkable progress in America, it's in the midst of a backlash period that we're trying to come out of. So I actually think it's a serious conversation that we're having. And, I support H.R. 40. There's an increasing number of members who support H.R. 40, including the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler. That's important because the bill's before the Judiciary Committee, as well as the Speaker. Nancy Pelosi has expressed support for it. And most of the presidential candidates appear to be coming on board.
And H.R. 40, John Conyers has been trying to pass that for, 30 years?
Yeah, no doubt.
He presents it every year, I heard, for the past.
He presented it every year, and Conyers retired about a year and a half ago. Sheila Jackson Lee picked it up, and there's significant momentum. Because my thing is, 400 years later, we can't even have a commission, a conversation as it relates to the impact of one of the worst crimes against humanity ever perpetrated. When we see all of these feelings still being stirred up coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and the rise of white supremacy. So I think that we're at a moment, finally, where we can at least have a serious discussion about moving HR 40 forward.
I think it's two questions, right? One question is, do you think black people deserve reparations? That's a no-brainer, right? And the other question is, will we get it?
Yeah.
What does that look like? I think that's where we're making a mistake too, though. We're not coming with a plan
Asking
saying
for anything
this is what
specific.
we want.
Right.
This
Yeah.
is what it should look like. We're like leaving it to the hands of our oppressors to figure that out. That's never a good idea.
Yeah. Well, in part, that's the purpose of the commission, to try to understand and drill down on what the end objective is. But I also think that, in America, there's not the same level of understanding of the impact of slavery and its continuing legacy. So part of what we have to do is an educational process, including in our own community, because there's been a miseducation that's been intentional about, the real impact of some of the rough moments that we've had in this country. And we have to raise that level of understanding, not just within our community, but throughout the country, in order to set the climate for dealing with the impact that slavery had.
You talk about backlash, right? And I think about how, to me, George W. Bush paved the way for Barack Obama.
That's
Barack
right.
Obama paved the way for Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is paving the way for the first female president.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
So what candidates do you think in 2020 could do it? Because I think we got too much emphasis on Joe Biden, but I think it's some other formidable people, and I think we really aren't looking at Senator Harris the way we should be.
Yeah. Well, I think Senator Harris, who I work with on a variety of different issues, I think is a strong candidate. Elizabeth Warren is emerging.
Mm-hmm.
We should look out for Amy Klobuchar. And that all speaks to the point that oftentimes these executive elections, like you pointed out, it's a reaction to the person who currently holds the office, and the American people often want to go in a different direction, even if they support the person who's currently in office, and we know majority of Americans don't in the context of Donald Trump, but they look to go in a different direction. So de Blasio here in New York City was a reaction to Michael Bloomberg. They're very different. Cory Booker in Newark was a reaction to Sharp James. Ras Baraka was a reaction to Cory Booker.
Absolutely.
So exactly to your point, if Obama's a reaction in part to Bush and Trump is an extreme reaction to Obama, I think the climate does exist to look at somebody like Senator Harris.
Why are black people so in love with Joe Biden?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, real talk, his relationship for 8 years
Barack
with
Obama.
Barack Obama
Absolutely.
is squarely at the center of it. And that's an understandable reaction because Barack Obama had to endure so much in terms of the hatred that was directed at him for no reason. Think about it. We got a scandal-ridden administration right now.
Right.
8 years of Barack Obama. No scandal, no indictments, no convictions, no corruption. And they still tried to get at him every chance that they had with no justification. So our folks see that. And who's riding with Barack Obama? Joe Biden, right next to him, has his back every step of the way. So he's got room as a result of that. But moving forward, I think most elections, Bill Clinton once said this, are not about the past, they're about the future. So Vice President Biden has to articulate a vision for the future to take us from where we are to where we need to go.
And he won't apologize for anything that he did wrong. Like, whether it was the 84 crime bill, 94 crime bill, the comments he made about Barack being the first mainstream African-American who was bright, articulate, and clean. The conversation he made on the Senate floor saying he don't care about the conditions that made these predators. He gave the eulogy at Strom Thurmond's funeral for God's sake. You can't acknowledge nothing you did was wrong? Like, to me, that's the same level of white, old male entitlement that Trump has when it comes to the Central Park Five.
Yeah.
Just admit you wrong, and we can move forward.
Yeah. Well, I think he certainly made some misstatements, and I think he'd be well served to clarify those, particularly as it relates to the comment I think that was just made in the context of he didn't call me boy, he called me son.
Sound right.
Now, as I understand it, he's actually told that story before. And in the context of the story that he's told before, he said he didn't call me senator, he called me son. And in this particular instance, for whatever the reason, he changed it up. But that one change has a whole different connotation.
Right.
So, and I think Rev Sharpton the other day I saw tried to kind of lay that out for him. And hopefully he gets it. I think he's a good man at heart, but he's going to have to defend his record, including, around the crime bill, just like everybody else has to defend their record.
Are we getting a spike in crime in Brooklyn now?
As I understand it, last time I talked to the district attorney, I think in some of the categories, there's been an increase. in crime in terms of the 7 major categories. I think in certain precincts, in the northern part of the borough, which would include in Bedford-Stuyvesant and in Brownsville, there's an increase in shootings, maybe even an increase in actual homicides. In totality, that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, we've come a long way, as y'all both know.
Absolutely.
You know, from the late 80s, early 90s, harder to crack cocaine epidemic, 2,000 plus homicides. I think we were under 100 in Brooklyn alone in the last year.
Mm-hmm.
But every life that's lost is one too many. And so, you know, I think our mayor is going to have to pay attention to some of the things that are happening on the ground. And we all got to.
What do you think about our mayor?
Together. Well, you know, I've had some areas of agreement with him, and I've had some areas of disagreement with him. I think aspirationally, he was right to say we need to create 200,000 plus units of affordable housing and/or preserve them. Aspirationally, that was the right thing because we're dealing with intense gentrification and displacement right now, including in a neighborhood where people like Biggie Smalls grew up.
Right.
But whether he's delivered on that promise in totality is unclear. And I think there needs to be a renewed focus because the bottom line is, what kind of city are we going to have? Is it going to be one simply for the wealthy and the well-off? Or can young people, working families, middle-class folks, the poor, the sick, the afflicted, can everybody continue to make New York City what it is, which is as strong as it is because of the diversity? That's what's being threatened at the end of the day at the core of this affordable housing crisis. And I think all of us, certainly City Hall, needs to do more.
You worked on the First Step Act, right? First Step Act.
Yeah. I was proud to be the lead Democratic sponsor.
Okay. How's that impacted criminal justice reform?
So it was an incredibly interesting journey. Congressman Cedric Richmond from Louisiana and myself, who you know, we were involved in criminal justice reform under the prior administration, working with a few other members, and we were hopeful to get something over the finish line in the last year or two under President Obama. But then the presidential politics got in the way, and Jeff Sessions was on the campaign trail. Donald Trump was talking this law and order stuff. Most people thought when he won that criminal justice reform was dead. But Congressman Doug Collins, who was the lead Republican from Georgia, came to me early on in the new administration and said, listen, I think there may be a pathway forward. Are you willing to have a conversation with Jared Kushner, who sort of was taking the lead on the issue within the White House? I said, yeah, I'm willing to have a conversation with him, but I'm not going to the White House. But if he's willing to come to the Hill, we could talk.
Wow, I didn't know you could decide whether or not you wanted to go to the White House or not.
Yeah, I haven't been yet.
Wow.
But my view was, I don't want to show up to the White House if it's just going to be a dog and pony show.
Photo ops, yeah.
Right? Because we've seen that. We saw that with the black presidents. Photo ops.
HBCU presidents. Yeah.
HBCU presidents.
The pastors.
Seen that with some pastors. We've seen that, you know, on the discussion around the Dreamers. He said he wanted a bill of love. And then he continues to peddle xenophobia, right? He said to Senator Feinstein and others, we're going to deal with the gun violence epidemic. NRA came to see him 2 days later, shut the whole thing down. So I'm like, I'm not going to the White House for a photo op. But I'm willing to have a conversation because the issue is so important to our communities, those that have been devastated by mass incarceration. Let's see whether there's something there. To his credit, Kushner came to the Hill, sat with him and Collins initially, and it was a productive conversation. The thing that struck me is that because of his authentic experience with having his father incarcerated, I said, okay, it seems to me that he actually is genuinely committed to this. And so that began a process of us beginning to negotiate around what the bill, originally it was called the Prison Reform and Redemption Act, and it became the First Step Act, could look like. And then we just all collectively built a coalition. And my view was, we can agree to disagree with the administration on a whole host of issues. But if we can't come together to try to solve or begin to solve this problem where communities, families, individuals have been devastated by over-criminalization, where we incarcerate more people in America than any other country in the world, then what are we here for?
Mm-hmm.
Why are we on the Hill? And, we were able to build a case within the House and then the Senate, and then ultimately President signed it into law December 21st. And so, it's going to help currently incarcerated individuals successfully transition back into society. We wanted to make sure that we gave them the skills training, vocational assistance, education, substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling. This is all within the federal system to come out and become productive members of society. We prohibited the outrageous practice of shackling pregnant women who are incarcerated, which was being permitted under law in the United States of America. So we outlawed that. We increased judicial discretion so that judges could hand out sentences that actually are consistent with what justice requires, as opposed to the strict sentencing guidelines that were on the books. And perhaps the most important thing that we did, a whole host of things, but the most important thing was we retroactively applied the change to the crack cocaine, powder cocaine sentencing disparity fix, because there was no justification for that. Originally, it was 100-1. 2010, it dropped down to 18-1, but it wasn't made retroactive. So you had all these brothers who were sitting in the federal penitentiary on sentences that Congress said were unjust. But because it wasn't made retroactive, they're still there. So we made it retroactive, and on January 3rd, the first person was released under that sentencing fix. Matthew Charles, African-American, who was supposed to serve 35-year sentence, was able to get out, and over 1,000 people have got out subsequent to that. So it's a start.
Yeah.
There's still a lot more work that needs to be done, but we needed to get the ball rolling.
I see they couldn't pass marijuana recreational in New York. They're having a hard time with that. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think on that issue, many of my former colleagues, Envy, as you know, I served, as I mentioned, in the state legislature, have taken, I believe, the correct position that if we legalize marijuana, we have to make sure that the communities that suffered the most have an opportunity to benefit from the industry and the economic yield that's going to take place when you totally legalize it. Because we've seen the situation in California not go the way that it should in terms of those communities in South Central Los Angeles and
same thing in Denver,
same thing in Denver. Absolutely. So I think the line in the sand was drawn by many of us inside the state legislature and outside the state legislature to say, if we go down this road, we got to do it differently.
Right.
To make sure that black and brown communities that were adversely impacted by the war on drugs have an opportunity to have a meaningful seat at the table.
They had some crazy stipulations, though. You had to have $1 million in assets or $1 million liquid. Like, they had some crazy boundaries if you wanted to own your own.
Yeah,
that's what the Marijuana Freedom and Opportunity Act is?
Well, yeah, so the Marijuana Freedom and Opportunity Act, our view is that's at the federal level, right?
Okay.
So Senator Schumer had been leading the charge on that in the Senate, and I introduced a companion bill in the House a few months ago. The most important thing that we can do with it is to deschedule it at the federal level, right? Decriminalize it at the federal level. That's what's possible now. And if we deschedule it at the federal level, then you allow the states to be able to do what the states can do, and you can legitimize the industry in terms of banking and everything else that needs to happen. And we're making the case to our Republican colleagues that y'all are supposed to be about states' rights. That's what federalism is all about, right? The notion that federal government does its thing in certain areas, the states do its thing in other areas. So we're saying the states are doing their thing right now. Let them choose. Do you legalize? Do you decriminalize? Do you keep the status quo? As long as you have this federal overlay where you have, marijuana in the same category as dangerous opioids, heroin, powder, and crack cocaine, you limit the ability for the states to work their will. We also are saying that I think we allocate or authorize about $100 million to try to incentivize the states to expunge past marijuana convictions. Because that's the other piece that was also on the table in New York that has to be resolved. That you shouldn't just legalize moving forward. You have to right the wrongs of the past. And one of the ways to do that, other than the economic piece, is to make sure that records get sealed and expunged of people who've been jammed up on low-level marijuana convictions.
I heard they said something like they didn't know what to do with some of the money once they got the profits in. Like once they taxed this and made the money, they didn't know where to put the money. And that was part of the problem they said they were having.
Yeah, well, I think the best thing on this issue is to get it right. And so they took an important step in terms of decriminalization in New York State level, because at least within the last couple of years, this changed really, and it was Ken Thompson, as you said, rest in peace, as the Brooklyn District Attorney, who said, I'm not prosecuting marijuana arrests any further. So y'all can send them to me, NYPD, but I'm not prosecuting. And that began to sort of change the dynamics, but you still needed to change the law at the end of the day, because DAs come, DAs go. So on decriminalization, that's important. And they got that done in Albany. But we have to get the rest right, which means sealing, expungement, economic opportunity.
That still irks me. You know, I guess this part of the United States where you can smoke weed in Denver, but if you walk across that state line and you smoke weed, you're going to jail, which is crazy to me how the laws vary from state to state. It's like we're not all the same government, which is crazy to me.
Yeah. Well, that is that principle that I was talking about where, you know, when the country was founded, one of those founding principles was, you know, states will retain some authority and jurisdiction to set their own laws, and then the federal government would have power in other areas.
Like same thing with abortion.
Because
the fact that you can't get abortion in this state, but you can get abortion in this, like
that's why it's state laws and it's federal laws, and different states have different laws.
That's crazy to me.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. I think it's sometimes we got to get it right, but part of the theory was, I think it was former Supreme Court Justice Brandeis who said states should be laboratories for democracy, so that the states could try out different things,
and we see what works for
and we see what works
for everybody. Yeah, what could work for everybody?
What could work, or what doesn't work, and then it works its way up to the national level.
I got a couple more questions for you, because you talked about reaching across the aisle to get things done, like the First Step Act, and it seems like the way you did it is the right way to do it. Because you see everybody's mad at Biden now because he's like, oh, he called me son. Strom Thurmond was a good guy. So is there a right way and a wrong way to reach across the aisle?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and one of the lessons that I've learned in terms of dealing with the First Step Act, was the other side authentically committed to getting this done, even beyond Kushner. That I was able to figure out when we had the conversations, and that was important because we needed the White House piece. But then in terms of Charlamagne, as you're talking about, within the Congress, are my colleagues in the House and in the Senate willing to do what's necessary to strike a blow against mass incarceration based on their own commitment? Is it real or is it phony? And when I first got to Congress, I was confused at the notion that there was actually a conversation going on between Democrats and Republicans and outside advocacy groups like the Heritage Foundation and the Koch brothers and Grover Norquist, right-wing activists on this issue. So then I said, well, you know what? Let me do a deep dive into what their views are all about. And I realized that fiscal conservatives had become convinced that spending $80 billion a year on mass incarceration when a significant number of people are nonviolent drug offenders and you're not making anyone safer, that's a failed government program.
So they cared about their pockets more than they did the actual
fiscal conservatives,
prison
right?
reform. Yeah.
So their view was, this is a failure.
Right.
Got you.
Right? We can invest this money in a different way. Now, we'll have to debate how to invest it, but they at least agreed $80 billion a year on mass incarceration is a failure. Boom, fiscal conservatives check. Then you had people like Doug Collins, right, who was former Southern preacher, still a Air Force chaplain. Christianity, I grew up in the black church. Y'all know. At its core is about redemption and transformation. And Christian theology is there's only one person who walked the earth sin-free.
Jesus.
Jesus. Nobody else. So if that's the philosophy, the evangelicals all of a sudden were all in on prison reform, saying somebody makes a mistake, we all make mistakes. They pay their debt to society. We got to help them successfully get a fresh start.
Wow.
And transform themselves. I said, whoa, evangelicals, the religious right, check. And then you have folks like Rand Paul, right? Third category of the Republican base, libertarians. And libertarians fundamentally are opposed to government overreach. So they say like taxation is government overreach, right? They'd say it's overtaxation. I'd say, no, you have to actually have a strong social safety net. The wealthy, the 1%, they should do their fair share. We'll disagree on that. We'll disagree on what they would call overregulation. I'd say clean water, clean air, that's consumer protection. But on overcriminalization, we were able to make the case, wait a second, if the government can take away your life or your liberty and they're abusive, you should be concerned about that level of government overreach probably more than anything else. So the libertarians were on board. So I think my view was if you've come to the conclusion that the other side can be convinced through their own philosophy to get to the same place that you think we need to get to as a country, then you actually have a way to move forward and get something good done for the community.
Speaking of that, the House just passed the Equality Act that protects LGBTQ from discrimination. Why don't black people get bills like that? And specifically in regard to police brutality. Yeah.
This is a vexing issue that I think we need to deal with. In 2016, there was a task force on police community relations that was formed by the then Republican chair of the Judiciary Committee, Bob Goodlatte, and John Conyers, who at the time was the lead Democrat. And we need to really deal with this effort in a systematic fashion because, the police killings of unarmed African-American, often men, as we just saw, out in South Bend, Indiana, continues in many cases unabated and often without consequences. And it's wrapped up in a variety of things that are in the DNA of this country in terms of black men being perceived as an inherent threat for no other reason than, their racial status and their presence. So that's a deep-seated issue that is harder to deal with than simply passing legislation because it's embedded in the soil of the nation.
That's right.
And so that's been part of the challenge. Now, there are things that can be done, around body cameras, around increasing prosecutorial accountability so that officers will know if they take a life in an unjustified fashion, they won't simply get a slap on the wrist or, in many cases, get off.
Yeah, it's got to be some consequences and repercussions.
No doubt.
Like there's none now.
That's the problem.
And I understand what you're saying when you say, discrimination is something that's in the soil of the country, but you can still make some legislation to where that discrimination can have some real life consequences.
Yeah, and that's actually what we're focused on. So one of the things, I've introduced legislation to make the chokehold illegal under the nation's civil rights laws, right, which would then give the Department of Justice the ability to prosecute individuals like the officer who killed Eric Garner, which the federal government, under the current set of laws, declined to do. The other thing is you can strengthen the civil rights laws so that there's more room to prosecute bad actors who engage in the excessive use of force, because right now the laws are narrowly written. So, for instance, Sean Bell gets killed, 50 shots. Federal government, under the Department of Justice, says, we don't think the laws permit us to go after those officers.
Which is crazy.
Crazy. Same thing happened, 42 shots, Amadou Diallo. Right? Now, there are successful examples of the federal government being able to do it. Abner Louima went after those cops. Ken Thompson actually was the U.S. attorney on that case, along with Loretta Lynch, interestingly enough.
Wow.
You look at people's history, and you see what they can then become. Rodney King case, famously, the officers were acquitted. Initially, at the state court level, federal government stepped in. But they can't do it in every case. So we have to strengthen the laws And that's what we plan on doing.
Well, we appreciate you for joining us, man.
Yeah, man. Give me your Twitters and Instagrams and all that good stuff, Hakeem.
Yeah, so at Rev Jeffries is my Twitter handle. That's my primary vehicle for communicating. Instagram, same thing.
All right. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, thank you.
Breakfast Club.
It's the Breakfast Club. Good morning.
Thanks, y'all.